Welcome to Identified.
We'd be running around like crazy and whatever. And sometimes, they'd be laughing at the table, and sometimes they would go quiet and they'd all start crying. And you're like, what the hell?
Right, as a kid you don't understand,
what's going on
now
here?
You know the history that they were probably thinking about or talking about, right?
But the older you get, the more kind of you start tuning in. And as one of my cousins said, she said to us, it was almost like Gothic fairy tales or something, that myth, those intense kind of like stories of suffering, of silence, of all of that. We started absorbing them slowly, and those stories would be repeated over and over again. So now actually, thinking back to some of them, I think that I've almost created a false memory in my head. All of those stories were, and they were fantastic storytellers, everyone. I think, everything that I do with my writing now has actually been informed, and helped along by all of that storytelling that I experienced as a kid.
Hello, I'm Nabil Ayers, author, music executive, and host of Identified, the podcast that delves deep into the complex world of family and identity. In this episode, my guest is the chef, Olia Hercules. In our conversation, we delve into stories passed down through generations in her Ukrainian family. Olia opens up about the silencing of her ancestors during the Soviet era, the trauma of displacement, and how the experiences of her grandparents have shaped her understanding of family today. She reflects on large family gatherings that were a source of comfort and therapy, the important role of food in maintaining cultural and familial bonds, and the strength she draws from these memories, especially amidst the ongoing challenges in Ukraine. We also discuss how cooking has become a language in her family, connecting generations. Stay tuned to hear Olia's touching perspective on finding strength through family stories and cultivating love and kindness in the face of hardship. Here's my conversation with Olia.
I have been kind of trying to interview my family members recently quite intensely.
Recording it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the furthest that I can go is actually my mother's grandparents. Mm-hmm. So my great-grandfather and grandmother. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, anything before, during the kind of Soviet years, they've wiped quite a lot of...
Really?
I mean, yeah. I mean,
there's
no records. No, there's no, and people have been displaced so many times. I say displaced, forcibly moved. For example, my grandmother, my mum's mum in 1931 was deported. Well, they were packed into a cattle train and sent to northern Russia and just left there for dead in the middle of winter, because they were kind of going through this process of collectivization in Ukraine, so the Soviets came and they ordered people to give up their land, all the farmers, to give up their grain, to give up their bread and join the collective farms. And if you refused, you were dispossessed. So my great-grandfather's land was taken,
So he refused?
The house, yeah, he refused, yeah. And his family, 5 kids and his wife were sent off in cattle trains, left for dead, and he was imprisoned. So,
Wow.
After that kind of situation, records
right.
Yeah.
They're actually gone.
They're gone, yeah.
Did you know either of your grandparents? Did you ever meet them as a child? Or,
Yeah. I knew all 4 of my grandparents. Yeah, so I'm lucky to have known them. And I've heard their stories as well. I grew up with their stories.
Right.
I think for most Ukrainians, it's a really important part of our kind of family and how we understand family. And because for many, many years, again, during the Soviet years, all of the things that have happened to them, they were forced to be silent about because that kind of incriminates you. Oh, you were deported. Oh, you were imprisoned. So you're the enemy of the people. So there was this thing that they called movchanka, which means the silencing, and they didn't speak for ages. It was just kind of
so they just showed up someplace new and just kind of had this secret and started new lives.
I mean, they did come back. So my grandmother did manage to come back to where she was deported from. I don't know how, that kind of bit of the story we've lost. But they were forced to be silent for a very long time. And actually, it's interesting that it was when I was born in 1984, things started loosening a little bit in the Soviet Union, the period of glasnost, and people started opening up a little bit. And actually not everyone, a lot of the older generation kept being silent. I think it was a way for them to kind of live with their trauma. It was really difficult for people to talk. But my grandmother didn't. She opened up, actually. So with my kind of birth, within that period, they started opening up and they started telling us the stories. I'm sure they were silent still about the details of all of those horrors, but the bones of their story were revealed a lot of the time, actually, during big gatherings. So my mom comes from a big family. She's the youngest of 6 children. Mm. So, our extended family is huge. Mm-hmm. And to me, it was interesting to come to the UK and find a different kind of understanding of a family, I think. And in Ukraine, to me, the family is not just the immediate family unit, my mom, dad, and my brother and me. It's huge. Like
that's how you grew up. That was the unit.
Yeah. And then, for us, it's 30 people plus.
Wow.
And we would regularly get together. And
all nearby or in the same town.
No, they would come from all over Ukraine. I had an uncle who lived in Moscow as well, so he would have come as well and we'd all get together at my grandmother's, sit at a long table, share food. The adults maybe will have a glass of wine or a shot of something stronger or more, yeah. And it was like therapy, I think. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, now I understand all of that kind of gathering, eating and sharing stories and singing as well,
Oh, wow.
It was a huge thing, and now I realize that was therapy to them. Mm-hmm. Now we have
to your grandparents or to everybody.
To everybody, yeah. I think, yeah. And to us kids, it was a little bit not weird, but it was a bit kind of, we'd be running around like crazy and whatever. And sometimes, they'd be laughing at the table, and sometimes they would go quiet and they'd all start crying. And you're like, what the hell?
Right, as a kid, you don't understand.
What's going on
now
here?
You know the history that they were probably thinking about or talking about, right?
But the older you get, the more kind of you start tuning in. And as one of my cousins said, she said to us, it was almost like Gothic fairy tales or something, that myth, those intense kind of like stories of suffering, of silence, of all of that. We started absorbing them slowly, and those stories would be repeated over and over again. So now, actually, thinking back to some of them, I think that I've almost created a false memory in my head. All of those stories were, and they were fantastic storytellers, everyone. I think, everything that I do with my writing now has actually been informed, and helped along by all of that storytelling that I experienced as a kid. I'm sure of it.
Yeah, that makes
They were
sense.
really bright, as I say, like the false memories in my head. I can just see it. I can imagine it.
You can visualize the places and the people.
I can visualize the places. I can visualize what was happening. Yeah. Even, mimicry, everything. It's a movie in my head. Yeah, wow. All of my family history.
That's amazing. That's a good thing, right?
It's
even the hard parts, it's probably cool to feel connected to that in that kind of way. Yeah,
it gives me strength, Wow. It's, with everything that's been going on in Ukraine and, my family, they're in exile again. It's happening to us again. My parents lost their home. FSB officers are living currently in my mom and dad's house, everything that they lived for. Yeah. All of my extended family, because I'm from the south of Ukraine, all of my extended family also had to flee in 2022. They left their houses. Everybody's displaced now. And so we're in that situation again. And when I, at times now, when I'm like, this is really hard and I don't know how to cope with this and what do? I just go back to those stories and I'm like, well, if my grandparents could endure even worse and to live within that system for so long, to live in that kind of the kingdom of lies, where everybody was, people were informing on each other and it was a really strange place, like any totalitarian state, but they survived and they remained extremely kind people as well. They didn't kind of harden. They didn't become, so bitter that they were bitter towards us or anything like that. There has always been warmth and love throughout. And I go back to that, to the source of that, and to just cultivate that within myself as well, because it's really easy to hate at the moment, but I'm trying not to.
And you feel like knowing that your grandparents made it through that and had the strength to get through that, now the rest of your family is in a similar position. They'll be able to have that resolve.
Yeah, but I hope that we can close the cycle and I don't have to kind of pass that on to my children.
You mentioned the dinner table, as an important gathering place, and you're obviously food is a very important part of your life. How has food played into family? Are there recipes that have been passed down, traditions, things like that?
Yeah, food has been huge, actually, on both sides of my family, on my dad's side, my mom's side, but I think on my mom's side, my grandma, the one that I mentioned before that was deported, I don't think they would have used that word, but in my kind of understanding of it, she was a real matriarch. Again, kind of like feminism maybe wasn't kind of a known or explored kind of concept. It wasn't at all intellectual in that way, but in her strength and in everything that she did at home. My granddad came back from the war and then from time in the gulag, broken kind of man. He was quiet and he was really funny, but he was kind of very subdued. And she was this force. I mean, I'm hugely inspired. She was, the word formidable kind of comes to mind. Still kind and good and fair person, but really, really strong. And she was an amazing cook, an incredible cook. Her family kind of came from the south of Ukraine, closer to the Moldovan border. So she would make things that, I'm a trained chef and I've worked in restaurants, but I can tell you that, I still have another at least 15 years of practice to do some things that she's done. Or, I've seen super kind of amazing chefs working and I'm like, I bet you can't do what my mom used to do with phyllo pastry, for example, like stretching it so thinly. I'm kind of motioning with my arms sideways now. She would stretch it thinly on the backs of her hands kind of thing. And my mom can do that as well, she would throw it in the air like a pizzaiolo. Yeah. So imagine not just like a pizza dough, but this thin veil of a dough being thrown in the air and kind of making a circle. And then she'd catch it again and stretch it further. And each time she would do that. So imagine, it was magic to watch that, to grow up with that, to see my mom do that.
And can you do that?
I'm practicing.
You're not there yet.
I'm semi there. No, I still need some practice for sure.
That's incredible. I mean, it's literally been handed down.
Yeah, it has. Yeah. My mom is an incredible cook, but my dad also is. And it's interesting to see a pattern. It's almost like my husband is also a professional cook and a food writer, but we have very different kind of styles. And I realized that it almost mimics my mom and dad. So my mom is, everything that's been passed down, traditional kind of knowledge, all of that ancestral stuff, like she does that. And I do that as well, I think. And Joe and my dad are very kind of creative and they see a thing and then they just do something incredible with it. And,
maybe other than the incredible part, that's the kind of chef I am. I love to cook, but I'm terrible with recipes. I like to just sort of like, it's like a painting or something. I like to make it and add and change and hopefully it turns out okay. And,
I also cook intuitively, but it's that kind of that little bit of creativity and not being afraid of putting some things together is something that I feel like, definitely it's my dad and my husband, Joe, are very good at that. And it's interesting to see the patterns repeating in a way.
Do your kids cook? Are they old enough to cook?
Yeah. Both of them actually. So Sasha is nearly 12 and he's been cooking from a very early age. I must say, like me as a kid, we were, I don't know, in Ukrainian households, I think people are so busy, like we were encouraged to watch, but it was never like, oh, and come here and stand by my side and we'll make a thing. Like, that was not a thing.
So it was like a magic show.
It was more like, you can help me to pit these cherries, but like, okay, now I'm busy, so I kind of...
do the hard work.
absorb the things by osmosis kind of thing. With Sasha, I'm, being the parent of a kind of the 21st century, we've cooked since he was very little. And my son, Wilfred, is also very interested in food. And I feel like it's really helping him. So when was it? Like a year ago, we found out that Wilf, who's now 4, has Fragile X syndrome, which I've apparently passed on. It's basically when your X chromosome is damaged. So because I have 2 X chromosomes, it doesn't affect me in the same way as him, but it affects him. Kind of, he's got like, global developmental delay, as they call it. So his speech is slow. There's loads of things going on, and we do a lot of things to kind of help him out. Life is going to be a little bit more complicated for him than for other people. But one thing that I think is really helping and that he's incredible at is cooking. So he was born 2 months before the pandemic started. And when he was born, Joe, my husband, would, he was at home. So he was actually testing for his cookbook or something like that. So, he was just constantly cooking and he would just put him, in a sling, and Wilfred would just like be hanging and just observing everything that Joe was doing. And it was just, I guess it just became a very kind of like a special interest to him, because it was just something that he saw every day in that consistent way, and it was really interesting. So now he can, he's got it's a kid's knife, but it's a proper knife, and he can use it, I can tell you. Like my mom...
And how old? He's 3 or 4?
He's just turned 4. Wow. And I've sent them a video the other day, and he's slicing potatoes perfectly. And, he doesn't really like watching TV, but him and my husband watch these pizza videos. He's just obsessed with food, and he loves to eat as well. And yeah, I don't know, I just feel like it's doing a whole lot of good for him and for us to connect, for so long when speech wasn't an option for us. We did literally connect through being together, smelling things, tasting things.
Yeah, so it's a form of communication.
Yeah, it's a form of a language, yeah.
Yeah, it's like music or art, so many things like that.
Yeah.
That's amazing. You said you grew up with your parents and one brother, is that right? Did you, compared to the other families in your neighborhood or in your area, was your family a normal family, or was it different than other people you grew up with? I guess in many ways our family was normal. It's such an interesting question. Well, I thought that we were for ages, And now I'm thinking maybe we are a little bit weird. I don't know. It's a really interesting question, and I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I think in many ways we were normal, we didn't stand out. But now, kind of thinking back, and perhaps there are many families just like us with this kind of but with this reverence of family history is really strong. I feel like it's been a really strong force in my life. And so, for example, I just wanted to mention this story, and listeners, just listen to this. I know it's going to sound really weird, but I was a single parent for quite a while. And I was here in London by myself, working as a freelancer, and suddenly find myself with a 1-year-old kid. And, my family is not here. My family is in Ukraine. I've kind of had a really fantastic group of friends that would help me, but still that family unit wasn't there. And I had a really kind of low kind of period of, I think I was depressed actually. And I decided, okay, I don't want to my mom is worried as it is, I don't want to just constantly worry her. So I saved some money and I went to see a therapist for the first time in my life. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to unravel some things, I'm going to talk to her and she's going to make me feel better. And, you sit down and she, as a normal thing, she just asks you some questions in the beginning. And then she asks me, what's your religion? And it just kind of came out of my mouth. And I said, my family. And you could just see her eyes kind of going up at me oh my God, she probably thought right.
I'm in some kind of a weird cult. You know what I mean?
That's not one of the 5 multiple choice answers.
Yeah, that's not, that's not how I meant it. I think what I meant because we're not religious, we kind of go with the traditions, and for Easter and Christmas we do this and that, but we never really did church or anything like that. I'm spiritual, but not religious. But when that came out, I actually kind of shocked myself, and I was like, oh my God, she must think I'm some kind of a part of a weird cult. And actually, I never went back because I was so embarrassed about saying that.
No.
And I was too kind of shy to explain what I meant. And maybe I didn't know what I meant. But now I realized that when I said that, I think it was that, so when I mentioned the stories that we kind of grew up with, that mythological, almost like a family mythology, and those stories like myths that carry you through life, I think that's what I meant. To me, family has always been just this incredible force and an incredible source of strength. And something that when the war started, for example, in 2022, one of the things that I did was talk to my grandmother, I know she might not hear me, but I did speak to her, took a photograph of her or whatever, as a kind of, again, almost like a form of therapy, just kind of talking to her, talking to myself, trying to find that source of strength. I mean, you do crazy things when you're going through trauma, right? But yeah, so I think that was it. And I feel like, and again, I can't speak for everyone, perhaps a lot of Ukrainian families have found strength from similar stories, but I feel like it was particularly strong in my household. And given the number of us as well, like the really big family that my mom came from, which wasn't necessarily such a common thing, 6 children. It seems like in those years, like that was a normal thing.
Right,
but actually,
a lot of people had a lot of kids, yeah.
Yeah, but actually during the Soviet Union, maybe not even so much, 2 kids was kind of the norm. So I don't know, maybe that kind of makes us a little bit weird or strange or different.
The fact that you had this extended family.
And that kind of mythologizing and reverence of the story, of the kind of the origin story and the strength that carries within.
It completely makes sense what your answer about your family being your religion when you explain it that way.
Yeah.
It makes tons of sense.
I should have tried to explain it to her because she looked at me very funny.
I'm sure she's still wondering.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, what is family? But I feel like you just...
Sorry.
I feel like you just answered that question already.
Well, because I moved here I moved to the UK when I was 18. I came here to study at university. For the first time, I did find myself kind of, lonely, like alone. And I can't say that during my school years, I have been so great at making friendships. It was always a very difficult thing. Uni a bit better, but, it was always kind of like, so actually, yeah, maybe I did find myself in a really strange position because I've always had the support and understanding and, of my family, and suddenly I was alone. By the time Sasha was born, I definitely have managed to cultivate a group of people who I call my London family, my UK family. Mm-hmm. So it's a group of friends that have, carried me through. I feel like I couldn't have done it without them, especially during those kind of, 4 years that I was a single parent to Sasha.
Yeah.
Imagine, like London is not an easy place to be without, you're renting. I've just kind of retrained to be a chef only 2 years before I gave birth to Sasha. So I was like embarking on this new career.
Yeah.
The freelancing, one day you have a job, another day you don't. Right. Childcare, it was really, really difficult. It was a really difficult period of my life. And I'm grateful for my friends who are still my excellent friends, my family. And that's another kind of dimension that I've discovered here in the UK. And I'm happy and grateful that I have found that too.
Thanks for tuning in. Please consider subscribing to Identified wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. And be sure to check out Identified on YouTube and identifiedpod.com, where you can watch videos from our interviews. Our executive producer is Kieron Banerji, and the show is produced by Palm Tree Island. The music for Identified is by Noella and Patricia Brennan. I'm Nabil Ayers. Thanks for tuning in.